We're going to start pretty much right on time because one of the things we did was some quick math and discovered that we promised you 10 things in 75 minutes, which means less than 7 minutes a thing. We don't leave any time for conversation. So we are going to go pretty fast. And what's worse is, in fact, it's not 10. Oops, there we go. It's not 10 because if you know Allison or if you know me, it's 13. And we even left to go to cutting room 4. So just as a heads up. But so who are we? I'm Cindy Van Dam. I'm the Writing Studies program, and I'm also the faculty chair of the AU core. So if you're teaching a class that's a Habits of Mind or a foundation course or an integrated course like a W2 or Q2 or a DIB course, chances are like I harass you about something or indirectly or directly. And
I'm Allison Thomas. I also teach in the writing program, and I am the Academic Integrity Code Administrator in CAS. So that means if you're teaching a course in CAS and you have a concern about something that looks like an academic integrity issue, I would be the person that you can call or email, and I would talk you through that.
Also,
stop there.
Because we're going to cover a lot of stuff, we will, right after this is over, send you presentations by email. So, because we're going to go kind of fast.
So to start off really lightheartedly, metacognition, which is one of the key words mentioned in our title here, is a concept of cognitive psychology that focuses on the active participation of the individual in his or her thinking process. This is an early definition, 1995. We've been thinking about metacognition a lot in lots of different fields of study, and we've kind of come to the next one from Chick, who's actually at Vanderbilt in their Center for Teaching Excellence. Metacognition happens when students gain a level of awareness above the subject matter. They also think about the tasks and contexts of different learning situations and themselves as learners in these different contexts. We purposely kind of looked for wonkier definitions because that leads to strategy number 1 that I want to recommend, which is a check-in. This is a kind of real-time assessment. It could be a quiz, but it doesn't have to be as sort of context-laden as the word quiz. This can help to immediately identify whether students get something or don't get something. Like, are you on the boat or are you off the boat? Unicorns. It gives them a chance to quickly and immediately practice a new skill, or it identifies kind of areas where you might want to spend more attention. And each of these sort of 3 purposes for using this assessment might look different or might use a different tool depending on what your interested outcome is. So maybe you're using this metacognitive strategy like, how am I thinking about this concept we just discussed in class? Maybe you're using that to figure out if students are ready to move on. Like, I need to make sure we're all on the same boat before we set sail, right? Or maybe you're using it to kind of like help students push to the next level. I want to see if you get some of the nuances of this issue or idea. Or maybe you just want to make sure everybody's thinking about it in a way that makes sense for the course day. For each one, you might approach it with a different tool. So if you're trying to find out, like, immediately, is everybody with me before I go on to the next topic, something like Poll Everywhere, which is a web-based service that's free. Students would use their phones to kind of zap a QR code or enter a URL and immediately answer a quick question. And you'd have results immediately. 75% of students said yes, right? If you were hoping to kind of parse out or introduce nuance to a topic you've been discussing, maybe you want to do an assessment and then have them discuss it with each other in groups so that they're kind of talking about what they came up with. If you want to make sure, like, we've been talking about this for a while, I need to make sure everybody's on board, I think you should be ready, I'm going to collect it and grade it and give it back to you later. So there's different, for each of your purposes, you might use a different kind of tool for this sort of immediate assessment. So if I were to say, what is metacognition to you right now, because I want to make sure we're all ready to move on, maybe I would use something like Poll Everywhere to make sure we've all got it. And based on the number I got in the results, I'd spend more time, or I'd ask some questions, or I'd further the discussion that way. You, of course, would be diligently writing that metacognition is thinking about thinking. This is really helpful, I think, for key terms, and that's why I'm using it for the first term, metacognition. If you have key terms in your class that are going to be new for students, that incorporating this kind of real-time assessment for that key term is really useful.
Okay, so the next thing I've named the guess why. This is one of my favorite moves in class because it's really easy. And it's really this idea of asking students to guess at your intention or your design. And in fact, I have two major questions. In fact, this is the one I used a lot, which is, we will just done something, whether it's an activity or a conversation, or gone through a chapter on a certain day, and I'll ask them, so why do you think we just did this? Like, what was my plan? What's my big scheme? Right? And so I ask them, like, what's happening? And then they guess, like, as a group, in class, as a discussion, like, what's she up to? Like, what's her motivation? And occasionally, I've asked this question when I don't have an answer. Because I don't even know why I did this, or I have an idea, but I want to hear what they think, and they almost always articulate something even brighter than I had in mind. So I like this version of the question, but also the other question, which is, well, why did we just read this? And you can ask them, like, why this? Why is this today, for example? Like, why did we read this in week 3? Why didn't I ask you to read this in week 7 or week 10? What value does this add to our coursework? You could ask them, are you expected to be doing something with this text later on in the semester? So having them sort of think about, like, why are we doing this? Because I think it's really easy for students to just kind of like mindlessly waddle through the semester and just passively let it roll over them as it comes, instead of saying, like, no, you should be like trying to figure me out. I mean, and it sounds kind of egocentric to say that, but like that's what I tell my students. Like, you should be trying to get inside my head, like, what's Cindy up to today? And sort of to turn this on ourselves too. Our first 2 strategies were, what was the first one? Check in, and then the second one is guess why. Why do we have these goofy little things, terms, at the beginning of our, like, what do you think we're up to by numbering and naming our strategies this way?
Also try to understand how it works.
What's that?
Also try to understand how it works.
This is a process. To understand how our process is going to work, you're going to see now that, like, I've got an idea that it's 1 and 2, and there's going to be 13, so we can see this is going to work. But you can also start to guess at the fact that these are all really micro strategies. We're not suggesting big, like, spend your whole semester building toward this conference proposal session or sort of like those things. We're actually offering the kinds of little things that you can plug into on any given day at any given time, however you want to put them in there. And you're not going to do all these sorts of things. My hope and our hope is that you really just find 1 or 2 that you think, like, I'm going to try that once or twice this semester. And also, I would recommend that some of these are worth repeating 2 or 3 times, because it's actually better for students to build that habit. Okay, so that's one. The number 3 suggestion that we have is the ticket out the door. This is a fairly popular thing that everybody talks about, but I don't know that many people who actually do it. I actually know 2 or 3 people who actually do ticket out the door, but a lot of people talk about it. But the idea of ticket out the door is asking students to figure out, like, what are you still puzzling over? We just had class. What's giving you trouble? So the ticket out the door, you can ask questions, the questions online or on paper. And a lot of people used to do it on paper. It was literally a thing you dropped on the way out the door, like you will the evaluation forms. But you could also easily do this online or a Blackboard. But you do it right at the end of class, not after they left, not a day later. But like, what did you wish we covered that we didn't? What's something you're still unsure about? What's one thing that you feel like you really got locked in? So you know as an instructor, what do I need to go back at and cover again? What are they still struggling with? What can I actually be sure that they've got and move on? Or if you think that they all say, like, no, I totally understand metacognition, you know they're lying because none of us do. It's too complicated for that. So that can also give you a sense of where their false confidence is from.
So this one's kind of like a micro-strategy within a micro-strategy even. I think any kind of opportunities you give students to reflect on their choices, whether it's their choices in putting this presentation together or their choices in ordering ideas in a piece of writing, is a useful metacognitive act, right? This sort of consciousness that, like, I decided to do this instead of this. Is an important way for them to assure that they're understanding material, but also that they are kind of taking some agency and authority in their own situations. So the organization workshop is an example of that. In my class, I have students think about organization as choice-based. They don't always think that, especially because they're used to reading things that are published works. And those seem perfect, and so they couldn't conceive of another possible organizational strategy that a writer might choose. So I asked them to annotate their draft by summarizing in the margins next to each paragraph what the paragraph is doing, not what it's about, what is the paragraph doing? How is it serving a larger role in the piece? So that means, well, they have to know what their purpose is then to answer those questions, right? And this is really, you can do this on Google Docs, for example, where you have comment bubbles. You can just write a little sentence in the margin, right? And so they're answering questions like, why did I put this here and not here? Once they've got their list of what's this paragraph doing, they get a quick summary in many ways of like what the paper structure is. They can ask, why did I put this here and not here? Why did I decide to do this and not this? What if I did this instead of this, right? These are all guiding questions that you can use to help students think about what order they've come up with. So I'm doing it here in this slide, which aims to offer a more specific example of the ways we can help students think critically about their choices. In this slide, I'm offering a specific in-class assignment students can use on in-progress drafts. So there are more variations to this as well. So once you've kind of laid out what each paragraph is doing, there are lots more options for how to work with the piece. You could rewrite each of the summaries on a sticky note. Now you have this really abridged version of the piece of writing, and you can arrange them in a different order. When you arrange them in a different order, what happens? Does the idea of the piece change? Does it look more interesting to you? Does it get closer to what you really want to do in the project? You can move your stickies around after you've written them on a note. Is there another order that makes sense, right? So you can look at the order you've got really clearly, and you can move them around. This is my student, Amanda. She we did sticky notes in class. She took them home. This was her new order. And one of the things, you can kind of see that, like, the beginning has a lot of paragraphs. And then there's this weird floater over here that doesn't seem to have an area, right? And then these seem more kind of balanced. And so she was like, geez, when I just look at this, I'm like, what's that one thing doing up there? It doesn't seem to belong to any section. It made her ask questions about why she chose to put that thing there and whether or not that thing actually belonged somewhere else. And so she was thinking about her original thought process and considering what it would look like if she thought differently about the project. So note-taking is important to lots of different parts of being a student. In-class note-taking is usually the thing that you see lots of advice about. But what I'm talking about here is taking notes on research. So when you have any kind of research incorporated into your course, whether it's shared amongst all your students or they're off doing their own projects, what we're hoping is happening is the information literacy version of metacognition, which is meta-literacy, an awareness of how we're consuming information. And I think a lot of faculty have some assumptions about students' experiences with research that are, at this point, I think mostly myths. That is, I think a lot of people have seen the sort of like high school, like, well, you get an index card and you write the source information at the top and then you put your notes on the index card. And it's like, most students are not reading research material on paper. Most students do not use index cards and handwritten notes to keep track of their research. And most students really don't have any strategies at all for taking notes on research or for organizing research. So the more you can offer, I mean, my advice is, well, I'll get to this in a second, but the more advice you can offer about like what to do when you're thinking about research. Here's some guidance in thinking about your process. Any research notes should have bibliographic information, whether that's a full citation or the makeup of a citation. Quotations with page numbers from the text, any specific references, and then a summary of the entire text in the researcher's own words. So you're asking students to kind of think of where their thinking is going to be in the future when in 2 weeks they have to make use of this source because it's a long research project, for example, right? Where are you going to be in 2 weeks? Are you going to know where that article was? Are you going to remember what page number it's on? Are you going to remember if this was this author's words or your words? The more examples you can offer of responsible note-taking, the better. And I would say, so this is my example. I show my students how I take notes on research that I do. I use Google Docs. I put my citation information at the top. I write a summary of the text. I put in specific references. I put quotations around everything that's exactly taken from the text with a page number. And then I have a thoughts, questions section at the end that's just my reactions, impressions. And then I do this snarky thing at the end where I like sort of judge or get a little cranky about what the source is saying if I don't agree with it or I think it's weird or it's missed the boat on something. Often my comments are a little crankier than that even. And so when I show my students this, I'm not showing it to them as like, this is how you do this. It's everybody has a process that makes sense for them, how they think and how they organize things. This is one way. My librarian, who visits my class a lot, I ask her to show her process. If you have other people in your class or other examples that you can gather, perhaps from colleagues that you'd want to show students as a way to kind of offer multiple examples, allow them to think about their thinking process to figure out what strategies make the most sense for them in terms of responsible note-taking. And this gets to organizing research, which I also mentioned. So it's not just taking notes, it's being able to come back to the pieces of your process and your search. That requires an awareness of research as a process and scholarship as a conversation. So we have a lot of tools for this that students will feel, I would say, 70% uncomfortable with. But I'm going to present you with what they are, because if you think it's something you want to recommend, I would say recommend it early and know that the library has resources to help students use all of these tools. These are 3 examples of citation management software. Zotero, Mendeley, and EndNote. They each have their own perks, and they each have their own kind of shortcomings. I use Zotero. It's free and open source. There's lots of space on it. To me, it feels like pretty intuitive based on other systems I use. Mendeley sounds like a casino, and I feel like maybe because the name sounds like a casino, I treat it like it's so flashy and it has this sort of back end. It looks like Facebook, where you can be like, answer the question, like, what are you thinking about? But it has nerdy thinking, So you can like interact with communities who are doing something similar to what you're doing. You can make connections to other researchers. Even if you've never met them, you can be like, I would like to friend you so that we can share our libraries, right? So that's kind of a neat component. EndNote is a lighter gray here because we've ended our subscription with them, but obviously you can still use it. Many students will have subscriptions that they've kind of carried over from high school. But it does require a paid subscription to use it. It does a lot of the same things the other 2 do. Citation software enables some metacognition in some of the ways that I kind of hinted at already. You can share your libraries with other people. So if I'm working on a group research project and we're sharing our documents, I can see what Cindy's finding and Cindy can see what I'm finding. I can type some notes that I have in the program so Cindy can see what kind of notes I'm typing. I have to make choices if we have a complex project and I want to build some folders, or Cindy wants to build some folders to organize our thinking. Even to trail bibliography, so using one source to find another is a lot easier through citation softwares. And even checking machine-generated citations. So most of these create citations for you. Zotero has a plugin that folds into Microsoft Word, which is awesome because you can just be like, cite this thing. Here's the library piece that I want you to do, and it does it for you. But like I tell my students, you can use any machine citation you want, but you have to be able to know if it's right or not. You have to be able to look at it and assess whether or not it's met all the criteria. There's a kind of like, how am I depending on these technologies, and is this okay kind of metacognition that's happening here.
Okay, so, and by the way, we'll have time to go over and follow up on questions that more details, because like that was a lot. No, I mean, I think everybody's going to have a lot of questions about how you do this stuff. Another strategy is a reflection memo. I think a lot of us have used some form of reflection memo in class. But trying to get students, just like we're thinking about the research process, trying to have them think about their creation process, whether it's a project or a presentation or an experiment or an essay or whatever it is that they're creating. And we have 2 different versions of this we're thinking about. One is trying to do a reflection memo during the process. And we're stealing it from this idea of who?
Maria-Elena Salvatore.
Yeah, one of my favorite people. On this idea of identifying the difficulties in your process. So asking students, like, what don't you understand? Why is this difficult? Or conversely, why has this been easy? Because that should frighten you if you're a researcher. Like, when things are easy, it's not going right. But also, what's frustrating you? But this idea that if we ask our students to pause in the middle and try to figure out what's giving you a hard time? Is it that you can't figure out how to find sources in the library, or is it that every time you click on a link it's broken? Is it frustrating you because it turns out that everybody's already written about what you thought you were going to write about? Like, what's giving you a hard time here? Because you're going to learn and figure something out from that. And in fact, we all know as researchers and thinkers that the difficulties, that's where the good stuff starts to happen. Like, this is the thing that tips us into something interesting. Our students, however, see difficulties as, fail, right? This is not a thing they want to follow through on. So trying to get them to understand and embrace that, and then how to adapt and adjust from that. Then we also think about the reflection memo that students will hand in when they've submitted their work, right? You've done all this stuff. I want to make sure it's locked in. I want to make sure we bake it into you before you move on to the next thing. So we might ask them questions like, where did you get help or support? Because that's not only good to know for future things in case they have to go see Allison, but also to remind them that getting help and support was part of your process. Sometimes a thing you do. What did you enjoy most? This is one of the questions that I always ask my students when they hand in an essay. What was the most fun part of writing this thing? And they like laugh and snicker and then write really good answers about the cool thing that they found. And so to remind them that this isn't like a horrible thing that they just did. It's actually a thing they created and they're excited about. I always ask them, if you had 24 hours, what would you do differently, to remind them that maybe time management should be a thing for next time. But then I ask them a different question, which is, if you could start all over again, what would you do differently? So that they think this is the only, like, if I had more time. But then I want them to think, like, but if you had really more time, what would it do? And then the last question is, like, what did you learn that you can carry over to a different class? I mean, this whole idea of learning transfer, which is what metacognition is getting at a lot, is I want them to understand that, yeah, they're taking a writing class with me, but they're probably going to do some writing in other classes. There's a good chance most of the rest of your classes are going to go write in. So what can they do, even though they're going to go write in Laura's class, which is going to look nothing like my class? But there's going to be a bunch of things that they can carry through, whether they're small strategies or large strategies about things. So trying to get them to sort of pause either in mid-process or at the end of the process to think about what do they learn and what do they wish they would do differently next time. Another thing that we do is, that I'm suggesting, is modified peer review. We thought about talking about peer review as one of the reflections and metacognition strategies, but I think a lot of us who want to use peer review in our courses, unless you're teaching a writing class, you've discovered that it's always a failure, right? Because they exchange papers, they sit in small groups, and they're like, no, it's really good. All you need is a new thesis. Like, otherwise it's perfect. And then they're like, so what are you doing this weekend? And so we found that it's not always that great. And in fact, if you want to talk more about how to have a really successful peer review, there's Allison and I would be happy to talk more about the fact that you need to spend a lot of class time and outside of class time to do that. And lesson number one, the one thing that I will say if you're going to do full peer review, is the students have to read the papers outside of class before they discuss them in the next class. They cannot read a paper with their peers sitting next to them and come up with anything smart to say that isn't, because remember, peer review is completely fraught for all of our students. It's more important that they don't make enemies than they tell people how to help their papers. So you have to give them enough time to figure out, like, how do I tell them that this thesis is no good in a way that won't, like, socially ruin good. So if you do decide to do peer review, I would recommend that you sort of think more about how you're going to take that time. But here's a way you don't have to do that. It's what I call first impressions, because of course I'm an Austen fan. And right, that was the novel before it became Pride and Prejudice. So this idea that each person just passes their draft to the person on the right. And this can be a near final draft, this could be a mid-process draft, this could be anything that they're working on. It could be a PowerPoint presentation, right? Whatever the project is. The students then are asked to read quickly their classmate. I always tell them they have to put all their writing utensils down or their keyboards away. I don't want them writing any comments. I just want them to read it and get the first impression of it. And then after they've read, I ask them to answer like 2 or 3 broad questions, just really big things. So, is the argument intriguing? If it is, how is it intriguing? And if it's not, what could they do to elevate or complicate this further? Right? Because this is what the student really needs to know. It's like, you've written a boring paper or a book report. Like, it's like 7 things I need to know about ravens. Like, that's not what you were asked to write. So you need to tell them, how do you make this more interesting? Also, you always need to make sure that they say, what's something good going on here? As I talk to my students in class, I always remind them that, when you're giving feedback, you have to give them praise. Because I promise you that if somebody said, Mohammed, that shirt looks really great, it brings out the color of your eyes, right? You're going to wear that shirt more often, right? So if I tell you, like, you have got a great opener, it's like, I don't know how you did this, but this really captivates me, they're going to be like, I can write openers. Then they'll become good opener writers, hopefully. And then the last question you would always ask them is, like, what do you wish they had done? What questions are unfinished, unfigured out? How can they go further with that? So this idea of first impressions, it lowers the stakes on peer review, It removes the weird smaller group dynamic because all they do then is just get this written stuff back. And then they're welcome to follow up. I mean, I usually try to do this so that it's the last one we do in class on that day. So they're handing everything back. They can actually like talk to each other on the way out the door. But there's no small group weirdness where they're actually not doing what you want them to do. And they just get some broad brushstrokes. And it also is a good excuse to sort of say, like, you just got some first impressions on your project. Now come to office hours. Let's talk some more. What have you figured out? What do you where are the difficulties? That sort of stuff. So that's another thing that I like to do, and a lot of us who are teaching writing studies and care about writing art, we think about the translation. So this idea of how can you take your project and explain it to other people? Because this is a good way for students to figure out if they understand it. So one way they might do it is, I've got my project. Can I explain it to my roommate, but also to a grandparent and to a room of second graders, right? Am I able to sort of translate my idea to all these folks? Or if this doesn't make sense for what you're talking about, you might actually think in terms of, can I explain it to the American Chemical Society and the Federal Reserve Board, and can I also write it for Washington Post op-ed? Like, how about these audiences? So choosing a range of audiences that are alike but not alike, but make sense with your project, that I think is what was helpful for them, is because you figure out, like, how do I tell the American Chemical Society, which maybe they'll know all about what I'm doing, so I really don't have to give the details. But when I put it in the Washington Post op-ed, it's going to be a whole different audience. Can I do these things? And that also gives them a sense, just like Amanda's wall of stickies. Like, what are the weird things that they have or haven't addressed that make sense for that? Okay.
So another thing that you can do to expand their way of thinking about the project itself is by using some kind of visuals to help them articulate, like, what is it that I'm being asked to do? What is it that I want to do here? You can do this throughout the process, at the beginning of the process, wherever you want. This helps you figure out, like, have I made the project clear to students? Maybe it clarifies particular questions that they want to ask about what is this project really about. And it helps them, I think, it can help them find themselves in their project, especially as they look at other people articulating it visually in a different way. So as an example, in writing courses and all over the university, we talk about the conversation as a metaphor for what happens in scholarly work, right? How might students draw the conversation is a question that I asked, because reading about it and seeing it in scholarly articles is one thing, but then trying to fit themselves into that or engage with the project I'm asking them to do, which is join a conversation, is really abstract. So I had a project that asked them to kind of draw a space where the conversation you've been researching is happening. Draw the people or person who's kind of saying something in that conversation. Write a really quick summary of what they're saying. So this is after they've been doing a lot of research. So, like, you've got a person here, and this is kind of the summary of her article, and you've got a person here, and the summary of her article, and then the student is up here at the top, and he's got a thought bubble too. And so he's kind of able to kind of visualize, like, oh, I'm going to try to sit at the table with people, and this is what they're saying. And he wasn't at this point able to articulate his own argument yet. But there was an empty thought bubble for him to start working towards what that might look like. This is Seth's. His conversation was business and marketing. This is Miranda's. Her conversation was in the field of sociology, and so she's looking at sort of particular areas of study and particular participants in that field, trying to summarize some of the articles that she read. And she was able to articulate a lot of things that she wanted to say, right? And so she had to kind of go back and say, which of these things am I really committing to? Which of these things will be most interesting to the stick figures I'm trying to communicate with? And so visualizing the project and thinking through where the students fit into it is a helpful way for them to not only take on a kind of agency in the process, but also to think critically about their own process.
So since we're in the creative zone, we came up with a handful of other really fairly straightforward but creative processes that you might try to. Because again, it's this idea of getting them out of their usual thing. Of course, so one suggestion was, again, to draw a map or a picture of your project. I think the idea of the conversation thing is a great one. Andrews and I were at a session the other day where they were talking about using an exhibit frame and, like, what kind of museum documentation would you have? Would it be like a little blurb to explain the painting, or would you need a whole wall to sort of set the context? And so using those kind of metaphors. I've also seen a lot of students draw a map of their argument. Like, what's the journey of your idea? Where's it going? Like, and just sort of figure like, well, first I have to go to the convenience store and get the basics, and then pretty soon I can go to the specialty store, and then I'm going to go home and cook all the things. Like, so it's sort of, you can have students draw some sort of map or idea with that. One of my favorites that I got from a colleague is this idea of having students annotate their paper by saying, like, what music should be playing in the background of this paragraph? And which, like, is this source rock and roll, or is this source jazz? But to sort of start to think about what's happening in their project so they sort of can start to picture a little bit more. The straightforward one, this is one of Lacey's go-tos, when you think of it, is bringing in scissors. Like, we talked about the sticky note thing, but also have them bring in a draft and cut things up, play with them. So you can either have students, for example, cut your own paper up and then see if you can rearrange it, what do you do, or cut it all up, hand it to somebody else, and have them figure it out. I will give you a tip though, if you ever do that. If you're having them cut it up, is you have to do something tricky, because if you cut it up and then hand it to a neighbor, they just line up the cut lines. So like, you got to be sneaky about that. So use a timeline generator. You can do something like that if you want to do something that's linear, or a mind map, something less linear, to visualize their process, to talk about, like, well, first I started here, and then I did this, and I did this stuff, and then I backslid, and I had to go find these other things. So I'm trying to figure out what is the right process, but getting them to start to think about research as a process can be fun. The old word cloud, there's nothing better than taking a draft and putting it into a word cloud, because then they start to figure out, I thought my paper was about X, but it's actually about the first cousin of X, this other topic, because this is the one I really seem to be talking the most about. So they might see their paper differently that way. This is what inspired this meme, but this idea of, and really what made me think of it was Allison talking about her snarky comments in the margins that she writes for herself about her own work. And I thought, like, what if you could come up with memes for each of your paragraphs in terms of what it's trying to do? This is the paragraph where I'm trying to set, like, the attitudes. So I'm going to have this meme, and then I'm going to go find another meme, and just sort of having students do something creative to start to think about how their project is working that is not the usual stuff. Another thing that I do in my classes is self-directed discussions. Let me talk a little bit about what I do, and I'll give you an example. But what I do is I put students in small groups. I develop an explicit sequence of questions. It's numbered and clustered and things like that. And then I give it to the students, and I put them in a group, and I say, like, you have 45 minutes to get through these 15 questions. You should take your time, but you might decide that some are worth more than others, and you'll figure out how you want to do that. But the explicit set of sequence of questions I usually have is I have a set of questions that's about the reading and the content. Like, what did you read? What was it about? Just like the basics, right? And then the next one might be like, now I want you to go back and look at the research that's behind all of this. Like, who are these folks? What are they saying? Why are they in this order? That sort of stuff. And then finally to get to questions about style and structure, right? But what I do is I in the questions I say, I just had you talk about this. Now I want you to, like, flip it over. I make my explicit thinking clear in the questions, so that I explain why we're getting from all these things, and then I explain how do we get from this last one. We talked about style and structure. I'm going to have a fourth set of questions that's back about the content again. So now that you've thought about this, like, now how does this argument work? Now that you've sort of picked it apart in all these little pieces. That's how I do it for writing class, but you can imagine what is the intellectual process you would want them to take in a guided discussion. Well, what I notice when I have my students do this, because they usually be in groups in the corners, and as I walk around, and I can do this, by the way, like 2/3 of the way through the semester or later, once we sort of establish the ground rules. This is not an early semester kind of thing. They're doing exactly what I want them to do. They're having a better conversation than they would have had if we'd had a large group discussion. But also they're like, oh, now I see why we're going to talk about this next. So they can start to see and express the metacognition kinds of reflection pieces that are happening in the class themselves. So I really like the sort of strategy later in the semester when you've got them, so to speak.
Lucky 13 and last is using scenarios to practice applying big concepts. In particular, the ways that I've used this is with the conversations I have with students about academic integrity, not just in my own class, but I do lots of workshops for different cohorts of students. I met with international students on Monday. I gave them a couple of different scenarios that, ask them to put themselves in the place of the student who, and then I give them a description of something that's very, very close to something I've seen happen. And then they have to think through not the question of for me, the question is not figure out if the code was violated. It's sort of what's going on here. is there an issue here? What's the issue here? And so zeroing in on the question that you really want the students to use the specific to highlight about the abstract, right? So this is one of my examples. This is a scenario in which you're taking a chem, so I use second person because it makes the student feel like, oh, this is me. I have to put myself in this position. You're taking a chemistry class, your professor's giving you a lab partner, you're going to sit and hang out and type the lab report together even though your professor says you've got to submit your own work, right? And then I ask students to think about what they see that's a problem or could turn into a problem. And so that asks them not only to say, like, this is bad, this is good. It asks them to explore some of the complexities here and to think, like, oh, at first the you kind of makes it okay for them to think, this is totally something I would do. I didn't realize that this was not appropriate. And they have to think about why it may or may not be appropriate, talk about it with each other, and figure out whether they might revise the way they do something. So they've got to think about what their process might be in these situations and realize that they have more choices than maybe they thought. So I think this helps make the concepts of academic integrity, the 100% slide I had, that's what I always say to students. When you are submitting work, you're telling your professor, this is 100% my own. 100% of the time in this document, it's 100% my own, unless I've acknowledged to you otherwise. And so that's a big conceptual rule. And students are like, yeah, duh. But when you have this in front of you, how do we apply that 100% concept? If I'm getting my partner's lab report, if I'm typing my report while I'm talking to my partner, what's likely to happen? Well, we're probably going to use some of the same words. When we submit that to our professor, will our professor be able to tell whose words belong to whom? I think maybe we've broken the 100% rule. Right? So applying the concept using specifics and more than one specific example is what I would recommend if you're going to use the scenario situation. Vary them in some key ways according to the concepts that you want them to get at.
Okay. That's a lot. I think, so we were thinking that if we had time, we'd have you do something like this reflective strategy you're willing to try, invent a scenario or visual for your class, or write some ticket out the door things you can use in the first 2 weeks of class. But actually, I think we should switch gears a little bit and just go straight to questions or idea sharing, because I imagine that you have lots of other strategies and things you'd like to tell the rest of the group about. So, like, what have you got? What do you need follow-up on, or what do you want to tell us that you do? We can wait you out.
How much of the sort of metacognition is related to the learning outcomes of the course, and how much is it usually about the assignment itself? Do you want to balance there?
That's an excellent question, Alex. I think it probably really depends on the course you're teaching, right? So, for example, if you're teaching any class for the core, reflection and metacognition is baked into the learning outcomes throughout the core, whether they're habits and learning classes or foundations classes or integrated classes. If you look closely, you start to realize that we're asking you to help students not just know things, but be able to do things. To be able to do things, they have to be able to think about their ability to do those things. So in that way, it's pretty present. But there are other classes that are maybe introduction to the major kinds of courses where we need to get the foundation level of understanding ideas so that you can move on through the major. But even there, we know that the more successful students are the ones who are able to think about thinking, that not just know the subject matter, but are sit above the subject matter as well. And so it's probably part of that, but it might be worth you looking at your syllabus and the learning outcomes that you put on there for whichever body has required you to put learning outcomes on, and figure out where is this sort of embedded within the learning outcomes of my class. And I think it's also worth thinking about when you're looking at your schedule of the semester, like, where are the moments where you know already, having not even met your students, that you need to stop and pause and do something. But then you also probably think, what are the really complicated little moments that also wouldn't be worth, like, I might want to have one of these in my back pocket for any given day. Because a lot of these things, frankly, you could do on any day at any time if the mood is right. Or you might get to a classroom and realize that your students are duds. They might, it might be that Anderson fire alarms went off 4 times in the middle of the night and they're very tired, and the thing you were planning to do will not fly because they're going to fall asleep on you. So maybe you're going to try one of these out instead. So it's like good to have that. But either way, hopefully reflection is part of metacognition, is part of learning outcomes.
I think the visual and creative ones, for me anyway, have been really key in any moment of turn. So like if I have assignments that are kind of scaffolded and there's this middle part, like you're turning in first part of the project and you're moving to second part of the project, like that day is a real opportunity to say, let's take a breath and think about what we've been doing in a different way. And especially one that like gets them up and moving around or looking at each other's stuff or using markers or doing something that kind of feels like, like there's a kind of childish energy that comes from like somebody bringing a bucket of markers into the classroom, And so I feel like those are the times in the assignment sequencing when to me it's made the most sense to sort of like go off the grid a little bit more.
Well, when I send students reading assignments, I advise them what to look for in the reading, and I give them specific questions that we will discuss in class. And two of the key questions I ask them is how, if of course when relevant, and I try to match readings with what we do. How takeaways from this reading relate to the next class assignment, or how the takeaway from this reading relates to a specific real-world problems. And we deal with world problems in my courses.
And so it's great because then they can see that it's not just this is the silo of information on this day and the silo of information on this day, but the impact it all talks to each other.
Exactly, and it's not just knowing what's the content, but also relating to the content to bigger issues, to stuff that allows them to think about how this connects.
And I think that's huge because, our students, many of them that we have at AU are trained to really think about, their high school training was like read the thing, know the thing. Not read the thing, know the thing, put the thing in context. Mm-hmm. And then 2 years later revisit the thing because it's really interesting in this new context. So training them to do that I think is really helpful and actually it's quite exciting for students.
Yeah, related to that, like I teach first year bio and a second year bio, and now I've switched to second, but I remember what they learned first. So related to what you're saying, I like to try to use my old slide and say, do you remember when your bio whatever said this? This is why it was important, and I kind of put it in the context. And I think they like that because we realize, it wasn't a one-time I memorized the term and then forget about it. But I try to do that whenever I can.
Building on your comment, I wanted to say, I was about to say this is mine, and then I realized it could have come from one of you guys in one of these workshops. But I put together a requirement in my complex problems class that they do what I call an SSA, summarize, synthesize, apply. Mm-hmm. So we talk about a lot of theories of prejudice. So to summarize, they just kind of have to summarize the theory of prejudice, but then to synthesize, they have to relate it back to how is this similar to or different from some other theory we talked about. And then the apply, I found that my students are very disappointed when they come into a class on prejudice and find out that we're not just talking about current events, but we're taking kind of an academic approach to it. So the apply is something I'm actually adding this time. It used to be apply it to a social group. This semester I'm going to try saying apply it to something you see happening in the world now that you think might be described by this theory, and I hope that will make them happier.
Yeah, well, and so just to build off of what you're talking about too, this idea that you have something that's called the SSA, right?
Yeah.
Just by naming something, right, and then referring to it over and over again, that also is one of the ways we build metacognition, is that repetition and that habit building. That's why we call it habits of minds, because we want them to develop all these habits and that they can carry forward. Because they may not call something SSA when they go to somebody else's class, but if they've done that 10 times in your class, they're going to be doing that for the next 5 to 10 years, right? So, which is a huge thing too.
You're talking about the biology levels. Another thing I think that's useful that also goes to transfer of learning is when I teach Writing 100, I actually have them do an inventory of their prior knowledge. Because there's a lot of research and transfer that shows that having students go back to their prior knowledge explicitly and then think about how they can use it and adapt it is exactly what transfer of learning is. And they just go and they just make a list. I tell them, list 10 things you have learned about writing and bring them in. And we work in groups and put some of them up on the board and talk about them and all. And then that's something that I can refer to throughout the semester as we're working on other writing skills too, so that they can see for themselves how what they learned before is now starting to be adapted into this new context, that it's not exactly the same, because that's the same adaptation I want them to continue to be thinking about. So I think recognizing that they already know stuff and showing them how it can carry through, I think think is really useful in a metacognitive and transfer learning sense.
Yeah. I think it's also worth noting, I know when I was a new teacher, especially I was sort of like, whatever you learned in high school is wrong. We're going to do it all over now, right? And realizing that that's not helpful at all, even if it might be like 50% true. But it's more that like this idea that like that was a foundation, and now
sorry to invalidate your day job.
But to in fact like let them know that yeah, so you learn 5 paragraph essays as a writing person. Yes, you learn a 5 paragraph essay. Other than maybe some essay exams, you're never going to use that format again. But there's some truth behind that concept.
It's not wrong. It needs to be adaptive.
Yeah, and so we're going to go somewhere with it. So getting to that place, I think, is really helpful.
I did. I wanted to ask you about consistency and reflection and how much, if it gets to be too much. For example, if you have them reflect during the process and then after they've finished and you have them do that throughout the semester, I get a lot of resistance when I do that. A lot of resistance. And is it best to shake it up a little bit, or is it best to stick with one, process the questions and have them think about it after every single project?
I've done it a few ways. I mean, so often I'll have like a reflection thing when all the major projects are due. So like on the day it's due, students know that they're going to come in and have to think about this in some way. And I vary the ways that I'm asking them to think about it. But I do think that like the exhaustion or the reflection fatigue is a real and potential concern. And one of the ways maybe to get at it is a bigger issue, which is like students will hear reflection and think like, this is a cathartic experience where I tell you how I feel about what I did. And it's not that I'm not exactly not asking about how they feel about what they did, but it's not an exercise in catharsis that's designed to help them release feelings about it, to sort of assess how they liked it or didn't like it. It's like, no, this is actually part of the learning process. And the more I can guide you through that, either using specific questions or being explicit about like, why reflection? I mean, there's sort of like meta to the, right? Like, why are we doing this reflection, right? What is the value of reflection? Does it just make you feel better about the project? Does it remind you how awesome you are? Does it make you feel bad about the time you didn't spend or you wish you spent? Like, maybe. But even more than that, it asks you to articulate what you did so that you can do it again if you want to, or to think critically about other ways it could be done. Like, those are real outcomes that you can't get without reflection. And so I feel like the more you can structure what you want out of the reflection, the less sort of fatigue threat, I guess. I don't know if you agree with that.
I think we would build on that by saying, and this is again this idea, this is the perfect moment in the semester to figure out what are the things you want to repeat, like an SSA. And maybe you do SSAs, maybe you do the S's and then you add the A later, and then you let it evolve, and then maybe you let it drop altogether because they've got it. But there might be some things that you want to do all the time because you want it to seem familiar and have a building. But I'm pretty sure that if I gave them sticky notes and had them do a thing, they would have no idea that that was reflection unless I let them know. And so I can choose whether or not I want to tell them that's what that was, or whether I just want them to do the thing and practice it and have a good experience. So I think part of it is, being strategic, because if you want to vary the things that need varying, but you want to build the deep grooves of the things that you want to make sure that they lock in. So sort of thinking about that probably is a good way to manage it. But a lot of the things we suggested here, they will never know that they're doing reflection work or metacognition work. They won't. Like, you ask them to do it, to put a soundtrack in the margins of their PowerPoint slides that they're never going to use, by the way. Listens to that. Because there's music kids these days. But even just that act of doing that, I think they're going to think it's an interesting experience, and then ask them to sort of figure out how to work with that. They won't be thinking this is the same thing as like when I handed in my paper. I kind of talk about my process. Most of those, but always. What else you got? What are ideas?
Well, I heard a wonderful one yesterday. This isn't my idea. I was at a new faculty orientation workshop, and we were talking about, as related to our summer text on extinction. So the question we gave them is, how do you get students to work with these huge, overwhelming, depressing, bleak problems and still feel like they have authentic agency? within them, so not like, oh, we're just going to be optimistic, but we really want to work through them, right, and what can they do. So one of the groups came up with this idea, the faculty members from environmental science, she said they envision scenarios themselves, right, and so they'll envision, let's say if we're talking about climate change, it might be that the students just envision a scenario that's totally bleak and horrific, but then she makes them envision a variety of scenarios. So if they envision one, then they have to envision alternatives to that too. And that seems to me to be a really interesting way to kind of deliberately push your mind into different places, which is, I think, a form of metacognition. But then they also talk about the different ones and how they came up with each one and why each one mattered or was different or how it resonated in a particular way. So they're reflecting on this kind of reflective process that they already did. And I thought that was just a really fascinating strategy that students would be very engaged in.
Yes. For those of you who are not aware, all the first year students, every year they read a book. We have a writer's witness program, and they read a book over the summer, and then on this year on September 4th, the author comes to campus, and the students can meet the author and talk to the author and have sort of this big experience. And this year's book is The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert. So be prepared. There will be a lot of existential angst.
It's pretty bleak.
As they learn about how humans are the next thing to become extinct. So that's why so let's back up a little bit, because we've got a little bit of time, but I also know that we've got reflection fatigue ourselves. But what I'd like you to do is turn and talk to one person or two people, if you feel so inclined, and talk about what's something that you're going to try. Maybe early in the semester, what's anything you're going to try late in the semester? What's something that you think is a terrible idea that you don't want us to know about, but you're going to tell us about the evaluation form, and you're taking out the door? Like anything you want to talk about relative to this. We're just going to give you 2 or 3 minutes. Discuss. Oh, maybe 4 or 5.
Hi.
Hi. Don't worry, I'm reading also the
I thought we were going to get everything I did, because when you and I were talking, it took so long. And when I was watching it, it was like, that would be they don't make it. I think there's one person like well, it's hard because like hardly you can have a slide that has maybe probably that has like visuals on all the slides. I was going to do that. So you could be like, oh, can you go back to that? And I was going to read my slide after this one that was like, here's the 13 things here. But it's on the handout. Yeah. Maybe we could ask if there are any specific questions about. So when we hoping that to get the tagging, we can say you have a preliminary or you have specific strategies that or at least, like, I mean, I can't, like, I don't want to get into too much detail, but pointing towards resources. I think part of the reason I also latched onto that so hard was because I was presenting about it at the course when I was in Vegas. So I was like, I'm going to share this idea with others and pasties. It's part of the presentation. No? No. No. I don't know most of I know I was just really sure she was still right in workshops, so I think one of her reflections she was modified course Which is really cool, and the ideas are different in a lot of ways. But I think part of it is like by that to like think about what you want to talk about and how you want to get out of and then it was like I put that up, so I wrote that down. I was asked to write that down. I was asked to think about it, but I was asked to bring my material. Which often happens in these things, but like I really like.
I think that's completely doable. Really want to have an hour and get down to some sense of guidance was hard. Also, like, investing in reports with them to take a lot of practicing.
If I can interrupt your conversations, I just wanted to offer any opportunity to ask more questions about the strategies. They're on the handout. We listed them 1 through 13. So if you had any particular questions about more details, we really sped through them, but hopefully you got enough information about each to try out whatever you feel you want to try out. But we just wanted to give you a chance to ask for more detail on any of those things before you head out or continue your conversations. Any specific questions about any of these numbered items?
So let's go ahead.
Do you all have like any resources that would help in like strategy 6, like organizing research?
Do you have any resources that would help with that?
Does the library do lessons in the citation management software?
Oh wait, can you go back
and
to?
move back up.
Yeah, so organizing research was I presented the 3 different citation management tools. The library does run workshops on, definitely on Zotero, definitely on Mendeley. I'm not sure what they're doing with EndNote. I know they had a session or 2. There may be one left this afternoon. Or if it was last week, I'm not sure. But any of the reference desk librarians that sit right front and center should be able to help you. Like if you have, you go in and you look at the website for Zotero and you create an account and you're like, this makes no sense, I really want to try this. You can go in and sit down with a librarian, or you can email them to make an appointment and they'll kind of walk through it with you. For me, I think Zotero is like pretty self-explanatory. Mendeley is a little bit less so to me. But you go on and you create an account and you've got like a web presence and you have a desktop presence, so your libraries can sync and you can see your libraries from anywhere, which is also really useful. But Zotero does a really nice job with support. They have really good support videos. When I use this with my students, I use Zotero for that reason, because then I can say to my students, because students are like, digital natives, but are really afraid of different kinds of digital things that they haven't seen before, and so they're not really troubleshooters. They're not really they're gonna email me and say, like, I can't find the document in my library. And I need to be able to write back and say, figure it out. There is a video that gives you a tutorial on this, or you can go talk to a librarian. So I would say, like, experiment with those things if you're thinking about assigning it. But if you want to use it for your own research, I use it for my own research as well as what I'm teaching in class. I would start with just kind of tooling around the site a little bit, checking it out.
I've also had good luck as a person who doesn't it's always my summer project. I'm like, I'm going to be good at this, and I never do. But invariably, there's some student, when we talk about this in class, there's some students like, oh, I totally use that. And then I have them give a little testimonial to how much better their lives are, because every article or every course reading they've plopped into this. And 2 years later, when they were like, that thing I read in that other class, what was that? It's there. And so they give these little stand-ups, and then everybody, 2 or 3 other kids anyway, will follow. And the rest will be like me, just push the kid.
Yeah. It's a nice visual, actually, to see, to visualize sort of what happens in scholarship too, because they will if their profile is open, which people do, scholars can contact them and say, I saw this article in your library, I'm studying that. I had that happen to a student, and she was like, the scholar contacted me. I was like, it's okay. It's probably fine. Your picture was there. Her publications were listed. And so it was a really interesting moment for the student to think like, this is a conversation. This is what scholars do. And like I said, the back end of Mendeley looks like Facebook. I mean, it looks exactly like, what are you doing, or what are you thinking, or I don't remember how Facebook frames it. And people can post articles and pictures to each other, and so you can see other people's conversations too. So it's kind of a neat. I think it's probably going to be connected, if it's not already, with LinkedIn. I think these are some of the future academic networking opportunities too.
Questions? Great. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.